001 video, ReEnlightenment, the University as Triad-PaRaDiSism or PaRaDiSism Protagonist. This topic about the university as third protagonist of culture, as I called it, goes back to about 12 years ago when I wrote this book, Friends of Dialogue. But this topic is in the twin Dialogue of Friends. The first one is Friends of Dialogue, and the second is Dialogue of Friends. It's on Amazon, of course, but it didn't come out in print. Well, it didn't print, but only in English. In any case, I take it up again, obviously, in this latest book, but I didn't give it the importance that it merited, so that's why I'm doing it right now. Anyway, so dear friends of dialogue, education is the baton of culture and the race of civilization. Contemporary modernity is the aftermath of the Enlightenment period. Today's crisis of civilization is a measure of the degree that the Age of Reason provided a whole worldview to substitute the broken theological one based on faith of the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. This period, encompassing the 18th century, is also known as the Age of Philosophy, on account of the fact that there was a return to the thinkers of the School of Athens Greece for inspiration. Of course, there's also the 17th century, the Age of Science, as forerunner, which saw the lights of Descartes and Newton, who did much to shape the things to come. Our claim is that if we're to break the shackles of modernity and fly free onto postmodernity, we need to go from enlightenment to the re-enlightenment. If the age of philosophy spanned as far back as Antiquity in Athens, Greece, 4th century before the Common Era, then the coming imminent age would have to go all the way back to Israel, to the Mosaic creation story of Bere'shith, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. For the time being, in consequence with the premises, let's refer to this re-enlightenment period as the age of postmodern Kabbalah, insofar as it both inaugurates the future of postmodernity as well as refers back to time equal to zero of things as Kabbalah. Verily, by this last term, Kabbalah Reception, we are referring precisely to the reception of the tradition going to the revelation of the Torah Teaching to Moses at Mount Sinai, supposedly during the Archaic times, like 1,500 years before the Common Era. Okay, so that's a long time ago. Of course, that's kind of hard to detail. We have already done all this backdrop labor of updating classical Kabbalah onto postmodern Kabbalah in past video essays of the series. In what follows, we'll be assuming knowledge of this material. If you haven't done it, please do your homework as soon as possible. Notwithstanding, it's always good pedagogy to do a quick review at each fork of the road. I've taught a few years, so we have to do review all the time. Well then, the analogy is the following: that just as enlightenment of the 18th century, by way of philosophy, is reason from the 4th century before the Common Era, it shaped the modern institutions of the 19th century on up to our present state of crisis in the 21st century right now. That re-enlightenment by way of postmodern Kabbalah as Triad-PaRaDis will likewise found our institutions going forward onto the remaining 21st century of the third millennium. Allow me to clarify the landscape of thoughts by way of an illustrative example. The constitutions of modern nation states are based on ideas from the 18th century thinkers. Case in point, in James Madison, the father of the American Constitution, as well as Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, was ambassador to France at that time. They were all heavily influenced by the idea of English, French, and Italian philosophers such as Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, just to mention a few. There were many of them, much more. These thinkers, in turn, as part of the Enlightenment period, drew heavily upon the ideas of Plato and Aristotle from the School of Athens Greece. All this is ultimately based on reason, understanding by reason, the capacity for consciously making sense of things, establishing and verifying facts, applying logic and changing or justifying practices, institutions, and beliefs based on new or existing information. That's just a definition. It is alternatively referred to as rationality. Humans are thought of as rational animals or else as thinking things. In either case, reason plays a central part in defining the human condition or essence. Now, none of this would be a problem were it not for the fact that one only knows causes by their effects. If reason is at the bottom of things in the West, how the West fares would be an indicator of how sound reason is. And by the look of things, modernity is crisis city. If reason was a whole, it wouldn't have produced such a shattered world. So then, the way of fixing things at a skyscraper height is to straighten things out at the foundation's level. It's that simple. The problem is the inertia that the force of attachment has on us, the nostalgia that grows on us for what we know. While it's true that bad is better than worse, on the other hand, no risk, no gain, and at the present rate of things, we're going to stay parked in modernity for who knows how long. Something or somebody has to torch the establishment and free the land from obstacles for a releveling and a reconstruction going forward. At the same time as this demolition of establishment is going on, we ought to be contemplating what to substitute it with by way of living quarters. Ideas take time to implement. There has to be diffusion, discussion, consensus, and planning. What we're herein proposing, as outlined above by analogy, is a re-enlightenment of culture based on the bottom line at time equal to zero, based on Moses' creation story as found depicted in Bere'shith Genesis verses 1:1 to 2:3. The good news is that we don't even have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to start from scratch. All we have to do within this tradition that has been studying the beginning of things is to update what has already been done before. In my limited understanding of things, as laid out in my work, PaRaDiSism, Human Science 101, comparison and contrast are made between classical Kabbalah and my contemporary updated version, which I named PostModern Kabbalah. Perhaps an attempt at genealogy could account for the specificity of Kabbalah. Classical Kabbalah dates from the Archaic period, whereas my version, as postmodern Kabbalah, comes from contemporary modernity by way of pre-Socratic Greece. So it's very different. The bridge between modernity and pre-Socratic Greece of the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era lies in studying the thoughts of the School of Athens of the 4th to the 3rd century before the Common Era, whose chief exponents were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The problem is that these three cannot be understood without knowing the background frame out of which they emerged. My understanding of the pre-Socratic period is that there were three schools of thought and one sect. Okay, the pre-Socratic period now, okay? We're past Athens, Greece. Before that, 200 years before, is called the pre-Socratic period, which were Greek colonies in Persian territory back then, what today is modern Turkey. So there were three schools of thought and one sect, as far as the historians can tell. One was called the Milesian school, the other the Eleatic, and the third was the Pythagorean Triad, and the sect was called the Pythagorean Tetractys. Now, the founder of the first school of thought was Thales of Miletus. It's called the School of Cosmology or of Physicists because of their way of thinking. The founders of the second school of thought were Xenophanes of Colophon and his pupil Parmenides of Elea. That's why the name Eleatic. The thought of this school was being is and not being is not. And lastly came Pythagoras of Samos, founder of both the school of thought of the Triad as well as of the sect of mystical thought of the Tetractys. My impression is that the school of thought of the Triad, that's where the Pythagorean theorem comes in. And the deeper understanding of the Pythagorean theorem comes from the sect, okay, of the Tetractys. That's my understanding of things. Okay, in my understanding of affinity of philosophical ideas, I associated the Eleatic school with Plato under the heading of idealism, while associating the Milesian school with Aristotle in contrast to his master, some sort of realism, though commonly called a hylomorphism or a combination of matter and form. But most importantly, I associated Socrates with Pythagoras, specifically with Triad Pythagoreanism, the philosophical school, and not so much with Tetractys Pythagorean, the secret sect. What I'm saying is that there were three schools of thought in the pre-Socratic times and one secret sect. And then 200 years later in Athens, Greece, there were three main thinkers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The comparison I'm making is that the first school, the Milesian school founded by Thales of Miletus, would correspond to Aristotle, more or less, okay? And the Eleatic, which is more idealistic, would correspond obviously to Plato. And then that leaves the Pythagorean school of thought would correspond more or less to Socrates. It's a very rough, okay? But everybody has a grandfather, okay? And even though the grandfathers may be similar in thinking, they're all different, okay? Same thing here. The grandfather, so to speak, of Plato was the Eleatic school of Parmenides. The grandfather of Socrates was Pythagoras, so to speak, and the grandfather of Plato would be, the Eleatic, and of Aristotle would be the Milesian of Thales. Okay, while studying philosophy, my main interest lay with the thoughts of Socrates, pertaining to the School of Athens, and with the thoughts of Pythagoras, of the pre-Socratic period. These are the two thinkers that I really, not that I didn't care for the other ones, of course I care for Plato, definitely, absolutely, and for Aristotle as well, but after, not mastered, obviously, you can never master those guys, but after being acquainted with those two thinkers, you want to move on to more deeper stuff, and you transcend Socrates, you transcend Aristotle, and then you transcend Plato, and you end up with these two thinkers, Socrates of the School of Athens, and before him Pythagoras, which is the grandfather, so to speak, okay? So then, from these two thinkers, I collected, on the one hand, dialogue by incorporating it in the ellipse, since ellipse has two foci, remember? And on the other hand, the complex right triangle of the Pythagorean theorem. Of the Pythagoreans, I took the concept of the triad, and as reserve, that of the tetractys, though I wasn't upfront clear at the outset. If you see my figure, there's an ellipse, okay, which corresponds to the dialogue of Socrates, because it got two. A dialogue means two people talking, and the ellipse has two foci. And then you have the right triangle, which comes from Pythagoras. So you see the influence on me of Socrates and Pythagoras in my Triad-PaRaDiSism schemes, okay? But as I said, the tetractys, which has to do with the PaRaDiSism, came later on. I wasn't completely clear at first what the tetractys meant, But that's another subject. Now, fast forward. 10 years later, when studying the creation story, it came quite naturally to associate the triad of Pythagoras of 3 and 1 equals 4 with PaRaDiSism of classical Kabbalah. That all exegesis comes in 4 tiers. That is PaRaDiSism. PaRaDiSism, it's an acronym with 4 consonants, forget the vowels, okay, PRDS. That is, PaRaDiSism means orchard, though it's easier to remember it is paradise, PRDS, PaRaDiSism. Actually, it is an acronym that stands for Peshat, plain, okay? Remes, remit, Derash, discover, and Sot, secret, respectively. Remember that you read right to left in Hebrew and left to right in English or Latin. Meaning that all this course is composed of 4 layers, as an onion of 4 layers, so to speak. Or better still, as the Russian Matryoshka stacking doll, which is a set of wooden dolls of decreasing size placed one inside another, up to 4 in this case. So the idea of PaRaDiSism is that when you read a document, there's always the literal meaning, okay? And then there is a meaning allegorical that kind of, like when I say, there was a man who had 2 daughters. One was virtuous and the other was not. That kind of, literally it means just what I said. But the way I say it kind of, it's allegorical. It kind of transports you to some kind of moral stuff, okay? And that's, so the way you say it is the remes, and that takes you to the moral, which is the derash. And above all that, the whole is a secret, okay? So those are the 4 levels in this dumb example, okay? The claim I made all along was that in following the suspicion of later Greek and Roman historians of the pre-Socratic period, that these three thinkers had acquired their core ideas from their Near East in voyages taken during their youth, and not from Greek mythology, which would be the obvious natural precursor. So then, in other words, these 3 schools and 1 sect, you say, well, where do they get their ideas from? Well, obviously, from Homer, because Homer came before. Well, guess what? No. the historian said that Homer was a mythology, magical thinking, and these philosophical schools, philosophical, not mythological, they didn't get their ideas at all, okay, from Homer, okay? So if they didn't get them, where did they get them from, That's the whole thing. So then I employed the same criteria that the historians employed to disqualify Homer, that Homer was not the source. In other words, mythology was not the source of philosophy, okay? So then I employed the same criteria of these historians to exclude, that they used to exclude Greek mythology. I used it to eliminate Egypt and Mesopotamia because they also had mythology, okay? And if you eliminate Greek, Homer and all that, well, you also have to eliminate Egypt and Mesopotamia from being the source of inspiration of these three thinkers during their voyages of youth. So what does that leave you then? Well, that pretty much left Israel as the only viable candidate left standing. Then, if this is the case, the backstory to Pythagoras and his Triad and Tetractys must lie in the clues laid out in the Mosaic creation story, as taken and found directly in the text of Bere'shith, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. That's the whole basis of this book. In this book, according to yours truly, I proved that these three thinkers got their ideas, okay, from Moses, okay. As I said, the historians discounted the Greeks, the mythology, and by that same logic, you discount the Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythology. And where does that leave you? Well, there's no philosophy, because philosophy is Greek. So what's deeper than philosophy that is not mythology? Well, Kabbalah, okay? That's the whole point of this book, okay? Deeper than, but it's tricky. That's where the catch comes in. Okay, so in order to square things, I felt it necessary to repeat the above timeline sequence of events. The point being that I discovered Kabbalah traveling opposite to the timeline of events. Obviously, I live in the present. I come from contemporary modernity, followed by late and early antiquity of the School of Athens and the pre-Socratic periods. In other words, I studied physics, okay, and then philosophy, and then I did the research, okay, from physics, which is modernity, Newton, Descartes, and all those guys of the 17th century and the 21st century today. I studied, and then I went back, because if you study all these thinkers, you go to the Enlightenment period, and there you have to go to the School of Athens, because that's where it all lands. And the School of Athens, as I said, you cannot understand Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle unless you understand these three thinkers before them: Thales of Miletus, Xenophanes and Parmenides, and Pythagoras. You cannot, okay? So that's what I did. But I'm working backwards, okay? And then from there, all the way to the late Archaic of Mosaic time. So then from there, I said, well, where did these guys get their ideas? Well, from Moses, okay? So then I went to Moses. And only then, after I did all that, that I bounced back onto postmodernity, proposing postmodernity, which in a way is moving forward, but by way of going way back to the very beginning of time equal to zero. If you want to go forward, you got to go back to the very beginning, t equal to zero, guys, okay? There's no way around it. If you go halfway only to the Greeks or the pre-Socratics, you're going to get stuck in modernity, which that's what's happening right now. And it's beginning to smell stale, okay? So then, with ReEnlightenment, I had to cover quite a span of time, from today's 21st century all the way back to the 15th century before the Common Era, okay? In other words, 1,500 years before the Common Era, okay? As compared to Enlightenment. Now, Enlightenment only spanned from the 18th century to the 6th century in Greece. So in all, the ReEnlightenment that we're proposing would cover 3,500 years as compared to the 2,400 years of Enlightenment. Ballpark figures, of course, I'm not a historian by a long shot. So then, at this point, we retake our line of argument of refounding our contemporary world on firmer bedrock footing. If you want to go to the bedrock, you have to dig deeper, okay, guys? If you only go so far, you're getting just a bunch of mud, okay? And that's going to get your structure, the higher you get it, and it's going to sink and tilt, start cracking. That's what's happening right now. Okay, so this theme on ReEnlightenment is impossible to exhaust in one sitting. So I'll keep returning to it from now onwards into the foreseeable future. So this thing that we're proposing about ReEnlightenment, based on these ideas and so on, obviously we're not going to exhaust it in half an hour, by a long shot, but we're going to touch it, okay? And we will return to it on multiple occasions. So on this occasion in particular, I'm going to simply pick a topic of vital relevance to current events and development, okay? So let's take out of ReEnlightenment which is going back all the way to Moses, okay, to t equal to 0, to be more clear. And we come up with all these new ideas based on postmodern Kabbalah. Postmodern Kabbalah is just the updated version of classical Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is just the study of the creation story of what happened at t equal to 0 based on, as I said, Genesis 1, 1 to 2, 3, and that's it. Forget about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. That's a different thing, okay? No, just the creation story. That's what it is. So that's what okay. So then let's take a theme out of all these things. Let's take the separation of powers of Montesquieu in the spirit of the laws as understood today to be the legislative and executive and the judiciary branch of government. Let's take that topic. But let's not be limited to his time and place, because back then he was in the 18th century. Instead, let's take advantage of present-day state of mathematics. In particular, analytical geometry, although analytical geometry was already there, because it was envisioned by the mathematician, philosopher René Descartes. But anyway, but later on they developed it into other stuff, more powerful mathematics like complex variable. Okay, so to me, 3D space is defined by 3 orthogonal axes, each one independent and on an equal footing. So we're working on an analogy. We're starting with a Peshat, the plain vanilla, and then we're doing the remes, okay? Making the analogy, the allegory, and that is going to take us, okay, to where we want to go, to home, okay? We want to go home. And that's where, well, that's what we need to discover, okay? That's where ReEnlightenment comes in. We're going to discover, okay, PostModernity. We're going to discover what we are, what's in us, okay? We're just going to fish it out, that's all. Okay, so this translates that the 3 branches of government ought to be separate and equal in support of a system of checks and balances that would impede falling back to the autocracy of kings, bishops, and of thought of times long gone. So the idea of 3 independent orthogonal axes is that each one is independent. Okay, so the king is independent of the bishop is independent of the kings, and in the intellect is independent of these 3. So each one has its own spheres, so to speak. Okay, in order to advance more speedily, we'll have to employ the power tool that postmodern Kabbalah provides us, okay? So now we're going to move a bit faster, applying all these triangles, okay? There is none other than stating that exegesis consists in 4 tiers of pardes as 3 in 1 of triads, okay? So then, let's move on here. So, our statement always is pardes triad, pardes triad means, okay, 3 in 1 for 1, like we are 1, yeah, but we're body, mind, and spirit. Okay, we're 3, but we're 1 together, and when we're no longer that triad, we're dead, okay? So something's missing, but while we're alive, we are 3 in 1, okay? And if you add 1 and 3, that's 4. So pardes is 4 tiers, everything is 4 tiers. That's the classical pardes, and the postmodern, the one I came up with, is the same thing. 3 in 1, well, 3 in 1 is 4, okay? Okay, so we then map the whole as a state, all the while the parts are the 3 branches of government. So we're going to apply this pardes of 4 tiers and the 3 in 1 of triads to the specific theme of state and governance, okay? It's a triad made up of 3 things, the judicial, the legislative, executive, and judicial. And as we said, this is the T diagram, and since some people get apprehensive, when they see little triangles, they kind of get scared, and everybody likes to take notes, okay? So transitioning from this to the more user-friendly or less, user-friendly, because this is scary, okay? People can really get scared. That's my impression. And people are very happy with this stuff, okay? But it's the same thing. So we're transferring from here to here, and we get the governance here, the state here, because that's a whole, and then we have the legislative here, like the Cornell notes or the college notes, and then the executive is with the notes that you take, the executive here, all the details, and the judicial is the summary, okay? So that's what we're doing right here, okay? Now a little background. I know that people hate mathematics, but let's fall back on the Pythagorean theorem in 2D, as it appears in the triad above. Let's take a closer look at it in order to gain further insight. In case you're not familiar with what does the Pythagorean theorem have to do with this and the complex variable, well, this I here means this is the imaginary axis corresponding to the spirit, because where's the spirit? Well, it's in the imagination, definitely. And this one corresponds to the real part, like this, real. I don't put the R because it's redundant, there's only 2. And one's imaginary, the other is the real. And this is the hypotenuse, okay? And from complex variable, guys, if you don't remember, we'll check it out, okay? So C is this, and then the what do you call it? I forgot the name of the complement or something like that. It's called this, changing that, and then the square is this, and then you end up with this, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so figuratively speaking, one can say that either the C, the hypotenuse, rises on the shoulders of two sides. So we're going from the Bere'shith to the Remes, okay, allegorical, and that is going to take us home to the discover to the Remes, okay, to the rush. So then this hypotenuse, you can interpret it in two ways. It either rises on the shoulders of the two sides, so this stands on the shoulders of these two, okay? C stands on the shoulders of A and B. Okay, so C comes to rest on the shoulders of the two sides of the complex right triangle. That is, a lower register would have that the hypotenuse depends on the two sides. If you are resting on the shoulders of two guys, well, you depend on those two guys, okay? Now, but there's also a higher register, and the higher register would say that the hypotenuse is not resting on these two guys. Rather, it comes from above, okay, and falls on these two guys, and this one derives this one. Okay, so this one breaks into this, and the other version is that this ones together produce this. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, that's pretty much the same idea. So there's a lower register that this one stands on the shoulders of this, and there's a higher register that this one comes first, and then from this one, the hypotenuse are derived these two. So we're talking from Bere'shith to Remes to take us home, all right, guys? Okay, so then if there are two registers, one could conceivably conceive a middle one, wherein the hypotenuse and the two sides are in an equal footing, though on a second story, with the hypotenuse equaling the sum of the two sides. So there's three readings. Either this one's produce this one, or this one disintegrated into these ones, or they're on an equal footing, but this is second story, okay? Because you can only achieve this one if you take the square and then the square root. So this is second story, okay? But still, they're on an equal footing. So those will be the three registers that we will be talking about, okay? Well, that's the Pythagorean theorem in letters or in words and numbers, okay? What I just told you, okay? Now, another thing to notice within mathematics of complex variables is that the vertical side corresponds to the imaginary, as I said. Okay, I'll do that. Okay, now, as for interpretation, the lower register, okay, we have to start doing the remedies, okay, interpretation a little. As for interpretation, this lower register is as if telling us that elevating on the shoulders would correspond to something along the lines of what we have today. Wherein the executive president, let's say this is the executive, okay? Yeah. The executive, okay? The executive, what does the executive do? Well, the executive proposes the list of judges. And who approves it? Well, the legislative, okay? So that this guy, the judicial, depends on these two. That's the lower register, okay? So that the judicial is dependent on these two guys. So it is the lower register. To my knowledge, we don't have any real correspondence of the higher register as of today, nor of the middle. But the higher register does not occur right now, but it did occur historically. Perhaps the higher register sounds a little too much like divine power of divine origin of power of kings and bishops. Perhaps not, okay? So the higher register is of another time, but it has to do with the divine origin of kings, okay? That this one comes, and from this one comes these two, okay? So, and this one has direct contact with God and so on. So it's a divine origin. But at least we can relate to the middle register wherein the three powers of governance of the state are on equal footing. Okay, so we don't want to go back to the divine origin of kings. That's way gone. That's like 500 years ago. Okay, but we don't want to stay where we are right now. You know, that the president picks, you know, for the next 30 years, and then the legislative, you know, depending who's in majority, decides what's going to happen. Oh, we don't want to stay there where we are right now. That's part of the crisis of modernity. That's why everything's broken. So we have to go to the middle register, okay? The question now will be, to what institution could the hypotenuse possibly correspond to in the real or at least realizable world? That is the question that we will now entertain. So I'm sorry if I'm very repetitive. So the higher register would be the divine origin of kings, which doesn't work today. And the lower register, what we have today, okay? It doesn't make any more sense, you know, but nobody questions it, so we just keep on doing it, but it's equally nonsense that the president decides from a short list, and then this guy, the legislative, votes on it, and the judicial is thankful to these two guys, to these ones, okay? And the origin of kings is thankful to above, okay? And either one is really bad, okay? Now, the point of all this is trying to figure out the projection of Re-Enlightenment period as institutions of postmodernity going forward. All right. Our declarative statement is that education is the baton of culture in the race of civilization. Let me repeat this. Education is the baton of culture in the race of civilization. You've seen all those relay races, okay? Well, education is the baton of culture in the race of civilization. This intuitively makes sense. Next would come, how would this claim translate to the Triad-PaRaDiSism scheme of things? To this challenge we now turn. So now we have this conjecture, creation, teaching, culture, education, civilization. We could conceivably say that with the advent of enlightenment now, the higher register of divine origin of kings and ecclesiastical power as then culturally understood when defunct, okay? It was outdated completely. It was a revolution, on that kind of subjects, okay? Obviously, that's what the whole point of the Enlightenment period, all that, so the French Revolution in 1790. Additionally, with the omnipresence of the crisis of civilization in our world today, we're living in a crisis just as bad as they had before the French Revolution, guys, okay? So we can safely say that the lower register of the president choosing, the president choosing and the legislative voting on it is just as bad, guys, okay? We're just pre-French Revolution, pre-American Revolution, or pre-World Revolution, because this is just as bad, okay? Okay. The question is how to identify the social institution of its correspondence in postmodernity. Sure, it's education. But specifically, how so education? It is a driving force in postmodernity. That's the question, okay? So let's move on forward to characterize it a bit more. So far, in following with a home building analogy of foundations, floor, and construction, we've done the first phase, the foundations, and now we must lay out the interface slab before moving on with the final edification of the proposal. Recapping, the foundations as cornerstone is that the whole is as the triad parts of a complex right triangle made out of the imaginary, which is the spirit, the spiritual foundations, the hypotenuse as the mental second story, and the real axis as the physical construction, civilization, okay? Like money, cars, that kind of stuff. Education is like ideas, all that, values, stuff like that. And these are beliefs, okay? Now, our claim is that education, for better or for worse, is the baton of culture in the race of civilization. If we live in a broken world, it must be because the master teaching lesson was overlooked. Teaching and learning a diaspora of knowledge is what breaks it into 1,000 pieces, and also what keeps it broken beyond repair. What do you expect? If you teach our kids not one whole thing, but 1,000 little details, well, and then say, hey, how come they have such a broken vision of the world? Well, because that's what we teach them, a bunch of disarticulated facts, okay? A diaspora of knowledge, break it into 1,000 parts, and then no wonder the world is broken. Well, because the way of teaching it, okay, we're breaking it to begin with, okay? So we teachers are the ones responsible ultimately. Okay, the worldview we teach our children in school and later on instruct them in village life, because we teach them in school, yeah, but they don't stay in school always, we grow as adults. And adults, where do they come from? Well, they got their ideas from school. So in the village, again, you are taught all these multiple skills, a bunch more facts and diaspora of knowledge, more and more and more. And this is fragmented simply on account of there not being a single unifying principle to give it wholeness. So there's a lot of trees, guys, but there's no forest. That's the problem. Too many trees, but very little forest. That's the problem. So no wonder we grow up thinking that brokenness is the natural state of things in the world. Obviously not, because there's nothing whole and everything's a bunch of pieces, okay? This fragmentation matrix goes all across the board, from big picture society to the microcosm of the character of the individual. Even hope has given into the machine of leaving things up to personal persuasion. Today, the way out of the maze isn't about optimism any more than it's about pessimism. Rather, it's about enthusiasm as the only feasible way forward. So, like, it depends. Well, what happened? Well, it depends whom you ask. Well, it's not about whom you ask, guys. What really happened? Well, it depends whom you ask. That's how bad it is. Okay, now let's move on to conclude the argument of the character of education in postmodernity with ReEnlightenment. Okay, so let's start characterizing education. Now, within reasonable doubt, in the book that I just mentioned, PaRaDiSism, I provided ample proof of the existence of a primeval common sense in all of us. So there is a primeval common sense out of which ordinary common sense comes in. Okay, in other words, there's a bottom line to everything. Okay, the buck stops somewhere, and that's with primeval common sense. Okay, thus it stands to reason that one can derive all knowledge from it. So if everything starts from one thing, and that's primeval common sense, well, that's the whole point that we're trying to make. Contrary-wise, it wouldn't be the case to begin with. There wouldn't be any bottom line. I can say, standing on one foot, and what is that primeval common sense? That the whole is as a triad parts of a complex right triangle. So the primeval common sense is that everything is a whole, which corresponds to the heart, and made up of the brain, okay? The right brain, the left brain, and the midbrain, okay? So we see things by way of the brain, okay? We understand things by way of the brain, but we capture them holistically or whole by way of the heart. But the heart is dumb, okay? Dumb in the sense that it doesn't speak, okay? But it knows things because it grabs them completely, okay? But we express them by language and all that. So we express them as a triad, as three in one. That's the primeval common sense that I'm talking about, okay? So then, besides the appellation of primeval common sense, the names given are the acronym PaRaDis, as we talked about. I give them a bunch of different names. I call them PaRaDis. Another one is Pecan, Seed of Life Model, or the Texas Pecan Seed of Life Model. I call it the takeaway also, because people talk about the takeaway. I call it the master plan, being a teacher. I call it the take-home message, Did you get on the news all the time? What is the take-home message? And the like. There are many ways that I call this primeval common sense, but they're all the same thing. Now, this nomenclature harkens back to the timeline of the Socratic dialogue, the Pythagorean theorem, all the way back to the Mosaic tradition of the creation story. So this primeval common sense, if you want to trace its roots, you have to go to Socrates, and to him Pythagoras, and eventually you end up with Moses, okay? And the guys who studied Moses' creation story is the Kabbalah, okay? So eventually you have to end up with Kabbalah. If not, then we're stuck in modernity, for the duration, however long we have. I don't know, because this thing is going to blow up if we don't figure it out. Now, at the classroom level of delivery of instruction, it says that this one thing, primeval common sense, and this one thing only, the cornerstone of knowledge, is all that should be taught in school. That all else comes by added measure of experience. Everything is three in one. How can there be principles, lowercase p, if there isn't a principle, uppercase P? How can there be many beginnings if it wasn't because there is one beginning with uppercase B? How can there be sciences, say physics, chemistry, biology, if there isn't a science, uppercase S? How can there be species if there is no genre? How can there be trees if there's no forest? That's the idea, guys. Okay. Now, situated in the present, after having gone back to retrieve the elusive, overlooked takeaway, the primeval common sense, the cornerstone of knowledge, of whole as triad parts, the challenge is going forward to fix our broken world, starting with us here and now. Okay, so we went back all the way to Moses, to the postmodern Kabbalah, and we figured out that there's this primeval common sense, and then I turned it into a useful power tool, which is this. And this power tool is what we're going to use, okay, to fix our home, okay, to do some some work on our home, fixing things, okay. That's the whole point, okay. Now, while it is true that the complex simplifies the complicated, still no one is a one-man band, okay? I am not a know-it-all, okay? By no means. No person could possibly juggle all the things, ideas, and actions going on in the world at any one time, never mind at all times, much less everywhere, okay? So I couldn't possibly do it. You couldn't do it either, okay? That's where the university comes in, okay? Because we have a bunch of people that study stuff and they can't do it. Now you get the idea of where I'm going, okay? They're the only ones who can actually apply this thing holistically all across the board is people, an institution that has the people that do that kind of stuff, okay? Because no one is a one-man man, no one is a know-it-all, but together, all these people, that's the best shot we have, okay? Because other institutions are dedicated to other stuff, like business, well, to making tires or making cars or maybe whatever stuff, okay? Okay, to cut to the chase, now we have to start closing it up, okay? To cut to the chase, allow me to establish a parallel of human knowledge with the human genome, the corresponding concept of mapping the human DNA sequence from biological science. Sure, there's free will. Well, in this case, let's draw up the opposing views and allow the stakeholder parties to simply agree and compromise in both chambers of the heart. In other words, going back to the idea of that we need to teach the kids a unifying principle. Well, this is the unifying principle, okay? So the way to teach things is to teach whatever you want to, yes, but somehow bring it back, okay? You can put all the crossword puzzles, like when you have a kid, you give them a box and before you know it, the pieces are all over the place. Yeah, but at the end of the day, you have to bring everything back in the box. Same thing here, okay? Teach them anything you want to, but at the end of the day, integrate it again to this idea. Otherwise, the kid's going to go thinking that everything is just broken naturally, and that's not the case, okay? Okay. In my understanding of things, the renewed world startup is for the university to play a threefold role going forward. Now we're going to start characterizing the university, which is our proposal as the institution, as the third protagonist of culture, of postmodernity, of ReEnlightenment that is going to take us home, okay? So then, with the definition behind this that everything is three in one, let's move on to our take on the matter of education in the greater scheme of things. I accordingly divide the whole issue of education into a triad of parts, namely, so then we have here postmodernity. So this is the proposal, guys, okay? The institution of postmodernity, which is ReEnlightenment, okay, is the university. And the university basically is three parts, okay, a triad. Primeval common sense, okay, that we have a primeval common sense, this is the spirit part, okay? And the agent of culture, okay? Because we live in we'll talk about it. And here, if somebody knows everything, it's the university, okay? And by university, I mean anybody that knows anything at one point or another, okay? Okay, let's see. Okay, so there's a universal primeval common sense, and we already covered it in another lecture. Now there's omniscient knowledge. Now omniscient knowledge, omniscient is okay over there, but knowledge, okay, is down here, okay. My proposal is that all subjects be taught under the unifying master plan that the whole is a triad parts of a complex right triangle, okay. That would be the human knowledge project, similar to the human genome regarding the biological aspect, just at this time around the intellectual aspect. What I'm talking about here, just like there's the human genome, where they have billions of chemical formulas, part of the DNA makeup, and they figured out all the human genome. Well, the same idea here, okay? I call it the omniscient knowledge project. If everything at the end of the day is like this, just like everything biologically is a DNA, well, same thing here. Intellectually, everything boils down to this. Well, use this to kind of coin everything there is of knowledge out there. That will be the human knowledge project, similar to the human genome. That will be this part, okay? Now, and this is where it gets interesting here. The university as triad protagonist of culture going forward. This proposal is that with the experts in the university employing the universal primeval common sense that all is three in one, it can get all complicated political and economical issues out there resolved within reasonable doubt. In other words, by the university in this triple or triadic role as protagonist, okay, of postmodernity as part of ReEnlightenment, it can solve all political and economical issues. Because right now, it depends whom you ask, okay? Imagine, 2 + 2 is 4. Is it or isn't it not? Well, it depends whom you ask. No. There are things that are just facts, okay, guys? Not opinion. Yeah? And many things in economics and politics are facts, okay? Others are opinion, yeah, but a lot of them are facts. But unless you have a group like the university behind it, it's going to be so politicized what we have right now, that it depends on you ask, okay? So then, let's start closing it up, guys, okay? Let's start by asking about the origin, okay? Let's start asking questions about political and economical issues, okay? Two things, two dimensions that we're going to be treating right now. Let's start by asking about the origin of wealth in a knowledge-driven world, okay? What is the origin of wealth in a knowledge-driven world, like today, okay? It is driven by knowledge, check out my cell phone or your cell phone or your car or my car, whatever, And you may not know what's going on under the hood. All you have to know is how to turn the key. Yeah, but there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood. The same thing with a cell phone, You can move it with your click it, with your finger. Yeah, but there's a lot of technology and science going behind it, okay? You don't have to know it, but there is. So what is the origin of wealth in a knowledge-driven world? Well, it's a no-brainer. It's the university. Insofar as it is the institution where research, basic, absolutely, but also applied, is done for the most part, okay? Not the tertiary level of research, which is marketing, okay? That's a different story, okay? Companies do that, and that's okay. But the basic research, obviously, the only ones who do it, basic research is the university, okay? And even applied at the secondary level, only the university does, because it takes a lot of money, guys, okay? And a lot of people. And they had to be doing only that. The tertiary, okay, the marketing, yeah, okay, that's a different story, okay? Companies do that, obviously. Now, the university is the only viable solution to address such an enormous task. No business enterprise could possibly come anywhere close to accomplishing it. It doesn't have the human or monetary capital required to reach the threshold. This can only be attempted by the general education institution, which is precisely the university. Now, the next step is to connect, and this is the challenge. How do you connect the university with the state and grassroots productive forces to get the economy on its footing, on its feet and running? It would do much to further the democratic project of a nation, for wealth would be naturally distributed, starting at the level wherein it is generated, and not afterwards, which being top down doesn't really trickle down in practice. So the problem with the distribution of wealth is that you have to start with not with the distribution, because it never arrives, guys, okay? We have to start with a generation of wealth, okay? That's where it starts, okay? That's the solution, the generation of wealth. And that's where the university comes in its role, because the origin of wealth is in knowledge, okay? And that's where knowledge, where does it come from? Well, the university, obviously. Now let's move on to the political question. Now to the question of who should choose the judicial power that we talked about. Remember the divine origin, or the president and the Congress and all that. That's a topic in there right now. Okay, so we already eliminated the lower and higher registers, having only the middle register of the three powers on an equal footing. That is, the issue is who should elect the judicial members, being the case that the lower register of executive choosing and legislative approving is out of the question altogether, as badly broken as part of the hardware of modernity. It's part of the problem, guys, okay? Not part of the solution, absolutely not. So then, our claim is that it should be the university who should be in charge of electing the judicial. Yes, the university, students, professors, I'm talking about from pre-K teachers, not pre-K students, obviously, because they're too young. But students, whatever age you want to give them, 16 or 18, whatever, but teachers at all levels, okay? And from pre-K all the way to, postdoctoral. But it should be the university who should be in charge of electing, okay, the judicial. That's a no-brainer, okay? So this follows insofar as the university is holder of omniscient knowledge. Remember that we talked omniscient knowledge. So who would be better equipped to elect those guys who are to judge? And to judge, you have to know, okay? Well, the university, obviously, who else, Not businesses, guys, not political parties, not trade unions, no. Not play parks, no. Those guys, nothing wrong, they choose the president and they choose the legislative, yeah, but keep their hands away from the judicial, because that's a different ball of wax completely, okay? Okay, so precisely what is required to judge fairly is omniscient knowledge, okay? Now we're going to get a bit deeper here, guys, okay? So don't get too scared. Recall from postmodern Kabbalah that the principal triad consists of Da'at, knowledge, resting on the shoulders of Chokhmah, wisdom, and Binah, understanding. If you go back to my other notes and the other video essays, you will see the principal triad that it's Keter, which is the crown, which is the circular thing, and then to the right is Chokmah, or wisdom, and to the left is Binah, and then at the bottom there's this Sephirot called Da'at, or knowledge, but it's not a really Sephirot, okay? It's generic, but it goes, and it's everything's on the node, okay, guys? And I'm using the classical nomenclature, not the postmodern, because most people are accustomed to this Chokmah and Binah and all that stuff, okay? So knowledge later on unfolds as a triad of triads, but you have to go to the nodes. But this longer inquiry will have to wait for another time. In other words, at one point I have to prove all these things that I'm talking to you about, but right now is not the time. Okay, this is just a presentation to get it started, to get the conversation going. But eventually it has to have proof. Okay, at present I'm just providing the conclusions. Okay, we're leaving the proofs till later, which may take me some time if I can do it at all. Still more research needs to be done on the present subject within the postmodern Kabbalah approach of re-enlightenment. Okay, that's the whole point that I want the people to know about re-enlightenment, because I am not a know-it-all, guys. Okay, I happen to stumble on this solution, yeah, but there are a lot of brainy guys out there who can do a lot more than I've done so far, but they need to know, okay, and they need to grasp this challenge and run with it. Okay. So for the moment, this should suffice to whet the appetite of those trying to provide a new foundation to their social project moving forward from Crisis City to Triad Paradise Earth. This we will address in future installments in this series. Okay, so then the idea is that the resulting hypotenuse proposal, I call it the hypotenuse proposal, standing on the shoulders of both left and right interests, is something that both sides can live with, however much none may be too happy with. We have to compromise. Of course, there's a lot more to it. But at the core is the idea that only primeval common sense and experts can reasonably solve complex and complicated problems to high standards. Think tanks are not trustworthy, guys. Okay, they're just political parties. The people they're paid, to opine in a certain way, and that's pretty much. Nor are political parties reliable on account of their interest in self-perpetuating their influence via ideology. Ideology is like philosophy, but they only tell you the side that they want you to know so you can vote in a certain way. So it's false reality in a way, ideology. It doesn't have to be that way, but it is. So the importance of solving these hot-button issues is that these are holding us back from ushering in the age of sapiens. All this we can now accomplish by way of a renewed world startup as outlined above. Once, with the university as interface in place, safely locked in with the cornerstone of foundations of primeval common sense, we'll be well on our way to opening the wide doors of the third millennium going forward. Once the issue has been adequately addressed, we can now profitably focus our attention on the topics of edifying our social edifice. For the details, guys, which will be many, it will be up to the actors involved to sculpt out the features. All those volunteers who like this guy, who like these things, well, they will be the ones who will be putting up the details, okay? So then, dialogue and consensus. Join the reconstitution of the world. Be the re-enlightenment quest, cause, and movement of all comes in 4 tiers of Pardes as 3-in-1 triad for a renewed world startup. Yours truly, Ricardo Turullols-Bonilla. Thank you all so very much, and God bless as always. Well, just in closing, I forgot to include these 2 slides, which illustrates the idea that basically this is just the same old scheme, but instead of putting creation and so on, we're putting the more particular down to earth. Now, the 2 topics that we were talking about was who is going to take the place of the we discarded, or the illustration, or the enlightenment rather, discarded the higher register of the divine origin of kings and all that stuff, and now we are discarding, by way of the re-enlightenment, we are discarding the lower register of the president, the short list and the legislative approving and all that stuff. And we talked about that, but I forgot to put it in paper, in slide. So we have here the role of education and culture. Obviously education, basically, that's the spiritual part. The political was that the university is going to be the one to elect the judicial branch, the judges and all that stuff. And the university is going to be the source of wealth, because that's where research is done, guys, okay? And in a knowledge-driven age, that's where the money is, wealth, okay? Wealth is knowledge, all right?
And all this we already talked about, but I had forgotten to include it here. So I am doing it to make up for the omission. Thank you very much.